He thought loneliness was just the price of being a good father. He was wrong. Gideon Fairmont had spent 3 years convincing himself he didn't need anything, not love, not ambition, not someone who actually looked at him. Then a woman he'd never met sat down beside him at a bar, studied his face for longer than was comfortable, and asked a question so simple it broke something open in his chest. She wasn't young, she wasn't desperate, and she was worth more money than he would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. But none of that mattered in that moment, because she was the first person in years who saw past the performance. If this kind of story speaks to you, love found in unexpected places, real people with real scars figuring out how to let someone in, then subscribe to this channel and stay with us. Every week we bring you stories that remind you it's never too late. Hit the like button, drop a comment with the city and country where you're watching from, because these stories travel farther than we ever imagine, and we'd love to know how far this one goes. Now settle in. This one takes its time the way the best things always do. The night Gideon Fairmont turned 32, he celebrated by eating leftover pasta, standing over the kitchen sink while his daughter slept in the next room. He didn't do this out of sadness exactly. He did it out of habit. The habits of a man who had learned slowly and without drama to want very little for himself. Elsie had drawn him a birthday card that afternoon, a crayon portrait of the two of them holding hands outside what was either their apartment building or a very rectangular tree. She couldn't explain which. She'd written "Happy Birthday, Daddy, I love you so, so, so much" in letters that listed slightly to the left, and taped it to his bedroom door with approximately 11 strips of masking tape. He'd eaten the pasta standing up so he could keep looking at it across the hallway. That was enough. He'd taught himself it was enough. Gideon worked nights at the Belhaven Register, a newspaper that had been dying slowly for the better part of a decade and refused to admit it. His title was senior editor, which sounded more important than it was. Mostly he caught other people's errors, the wrong date on a city council report, a misquoted city official, the kind of mistakes that technically mattered and that practically nobody read anymore. He was precise, and he was thorough, and he was so invisible in his own workplace that the new junior reporter had introduced herself to him twice, a month apart, clearly not recognizing him the second time. He worked from 9 at night until 4 in the morning. He slept from 5 until noon. He picked Elsie up from school at 3:15, made dinner, listened to whatever she needed to say about Beatles. She was passionate about Beatles, in a way he found both baffling and completely admirable, helped with homework, and put her to bed. Then he made coffee and went to work. This was his life. He didn't hate it. He'd loved his marriage once, genuinely, and when it had ended without screaming or betrayal, or any of the things that make a good story. It had simply collapsed, the way some structures do, not from one catastrophic impact, but from the accumulated pressure of two people who wanted quietly different things and couldn't figure out how to say so. His ex-wife Dana had moved to Portland. She called Elsie every Sunday. They were civil in the way that required real effort, which meant they were doing better than most. He got full custody because he'd asked for it, and because Dana, in a moment of honesty that he would always quietly respect her for, had said she wasn't sure she was built for the daily weight of it. She loved Elsie. She just wasn't Gideon. Gideon was built for it the way some people are built, for lifting heavy things not gracefully, not without strain, but reliably. The one indulgence he permitted himself was Friday nights. Once a week, after dropping Elsie at her grandmother's for the evening, he went to the Hawthorne Room on Calloway Street and drank 1, sometimes 2 whiskeys, alone at the far end of the bar. It was a decent place, low light, no televisions, the kind of bartender who understood when you didn't want to talk. He never stayed more than 90 minutes. He never talked to anyone if he could help it. It was the 1 hour of the week that belonged entirely to him, and he protected it the way other men protected their golf games or their fantasy football leagues, with a seriousness that would have seemed absurd if explained aloud. The 3rd Friday of October, he was midway through his first whiskey when the woman sat down. She didn't ask. The bar wasn't crowded and there were other seats available, which was the first thing he noticed. She simply settled into the chair 2 down from his, set a glass of something clear and ice-heavy on the bar, and within about 40 seconds, she was looking at him. Not the way someone looks when they're bored. Not the way someone looks when they're going to say something. She was looking at him the way you look at a painting that you can't immediately interpret carefully, without apparent self-consciousness. Gideon stared at his glass for a moment, then glanced sideways at her. She was somewhere around 50, he guessed, though he'd never been good at that. There was something precise about her that had nothing to do with how she was dressed, though she was dressed well. Dark blazer, no jewelry except a narrow watch. Silver threaded through dark hair that she hadn't tried to disguise or fight. She was striking in a way that had nothing to do with being conventionally beautiful, which was harder to achieve and significantly more interesting. She was still looking at him. "Can I help you?" he said. He didn't mean it to sound as guarded as it did. "I don't know yet," she said. He blinked. "That's not a normal answer. I'm deciding whether to say something."
"And I've
decided." She picked up her glass. "Do you always drink alone?" "Usually," he said. "Is that a problem?" "Not at all." She said it evenly, without the warmth that would have made it sound like a compliment, or the edge that would have made it sound like a judgment. "Just a statement. I was just curious." "About what?" She tilted her head slightly. "Whether it's something you want or something you've settled for." Gideon looked at her for a moment. The question landed somewhere strange, not offensive, just oddly accurate, like when a doctor presses on exactly the place that's been bothering you without being told. "That's a pretty personal thing to ask someone you've never met," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Most people would lead with their name." Most people into the lobby. Most people lead with their name because they want the other person to know who they are. "I'm not particularly interested in that right now." She looked at her glass, then back at him. "I'm Octavia." "Gideon. Nice to meet you, Gideon." She said it like she meant it. "You didn't answer." He almost deflected. He could feel the deflection forming something easy and closed, the conversational equivalent of a door swung politely shut. He used it constantly. He'd gotten very good at it over the years. The light laugh, the non-answer, the redirect. Most people didn't notice. He had a feeling she would notice. "Both," he said finally. She nodded, like that made sense to her. "Mostly the second. If I'm being honest," he added, which surprised him. He didn't know why he said it. "That's what it looked like," she said. Not unkindly, just observationally. "That obvious?" "The expression," she said. "Not unhappy. Not checking your phone. Not looking at the door. Just quietly somewhere else." She paused. "I recognize it. You wear the same one?" "On better days." He almost smiled. "And on worse days?" "On worse days, I don't bother going out at all." She said it without self-pity, which made it more believable. A bar you can sit in alone without feeling watched is harder to find than it sounds. "This one's good for that," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I've been coming here for years. I've never seen you." "I know. I've been watching you think that." The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "I usually sit at the other end." Gideon looked down the bar. There was indeed a stool at the far corner that he'd never thought much about, mostly obscured by a structural column and a slightly overgrown potted plant that the bartender clearly meant to move and never did. "Why'd you move?" he asked. She considered this honestly, which he appreciated. "You looked like someone it might be interesting to talk to. And I was tired of thinking I might be wrong about that and doing nothing about it." Gideon sat with that for a second. "I don't turn out to be that interesting, usually," he said. "I'll make my own assessment," she said. "What do you do?" "Editor. At a newspaper. Print?" "For now, optimistic." "Realistic," he corrected. "There's a difference." She smiled, then actually smiled, and it changed her face in a way that was difficult to look away from. "Is there? Most realists I've met are just pessimists who've given up defending the position." "And optimists?" "Pessimists who are better at sales." He laughed. He didn't mean to. It came out shorter and more genuine than he expected. "Okay, fair." They talked for 40 minutes. He didn't count, but he knew because he was usually gone by then, and the bartender had come by twice to check if he wanted another, which he'd accepted the first time and waved off the second. She asked questions that were blunt without being invasive. He answered more of them than he planned to. She told him almost nothing concrete about herself, nothing about what she did, where she lived, whether she was attached to anyone, but she talked about the city with a specificity that suggested she'd lived there a long time and paid attention to it. She talked about what it felt like to sit across a conference table from someone who underestimated you. She talked about the strange loneliness of being competent. "People treat competence like it's a personality," she said. "They stop wondering who you are and just use what you can do." "That happened to you a lot?" he asked. Constantly. She wasn't complaining. She was describing a fact of her life the way you describe weather. And you? He thought about the newsroom, the reporters who handed him copy without looking up, the publisher who CC'd him on emails to make sure he knew about decisions that had already been made, the junior reporter who'd introduced herself to him twice. Yeah, he said. A little. It makes you careful, she said. About who you actually let in. Or it makes you stop trying, he said. She looked at him. Is that what happened? He picked up his glass. Found it empty. Set it back down. I've got a 9-year-old daughter, he said. It wasn't an answer. He knew it wasn't an answer. But she didn't push. She just nodded, as if that explained something real, and maybe it did. He left at 9:45. She was still sitting there when he put on his coat. He considered saying something formal, nice to meet you, have a good evening, the standard phrases people use as punctuation, and instead just said, see you around, probably. She looked up at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Probably, she said. He walked home in the cold, his breath fogging ahead of him, thinking about nothing in particular, and without meaning to, thinking about her. He didn't mention her to anyone. He mentioned her to no one because there was nothing to mention. He'd had a conversation with a woman at a bar. It happened. He went to work that night, caught 3 factual errors in a feature piece about the city's water treatment infrastructure, and went home. Saturday morning, Elsie made toast and dropped hers butter side down and cried about it with the complete emotional commitment only available to 9-year-olds. And Gideon made her new toast and listened to 20 minutes of Beatle facts while he drank his coffee, and thought about the woman approximately 0 times. Sunday, he thought about her twice. Both times he told himself it was because the conversation had been unusual, not because of anything else. He was not in the habit of manufacturing reasons to think about strangers in bars. He was 32 years old, he had a daughter, he had a dying newspaper, and an apartment where one of the windows didn't close properly, and a manuscript that he hadn't looked at in 2 years sitting on his hard drive like a small quiet accusation. There was no room in his life for complications. He was almost entirely convinced of this by the time Friday came around again. He went back to the Hawthorne room because he always went. Not for any other reason. He ordered his whiskey from the same bartender, sat in his usual spot, and looked at the far end of the bar. The stool behind the potted plant was empty. He felt something. He wouldn't call it disappointment, but whatever it was, he registered it, filed it somewhere private, and drank his whiskey. He was there for 50 minutes before he accepted that she wasn't coming and started pulling on his coat. She called ahead, the bartender said. Gideon looked up. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Carl who almost never volunteered information about anything, slid a folded cocktail napkin across the bar. Said to give you this if you came in. Gideon opened it. In precise, slightly left-leaning handwriting, I'm in Chicago this week. I'll be here next Friday if you want to continue the conversation. Oh, he stared at it for a moment. Then he put it in his jacket pocket, said goodnight to Carl, and walked home. He didn't throw it away. The fact that he noticed he hadn't thrown it away told him more than he was comfortable admitting. The next Friday he went back. She was there, and without either of them saying anything about it, they picked up exactly where they'd left off the way you do with a conversation that was never really finished, just interrupted. He bought the first round. She didn't argue about it, which he appreciated. Outside, the October rain had started properly, drumming the pavement and filming the windows silver. Inside, the bar was warm and low-lit and smelled like old wood and something citrus from behind the counter, and Gideon Fairmont, who had spent 3 years learning to want very little, sat across from a woman who looked at him like he was worth the effort and felt something begin to shift in a place he thought had long since gone still. He didn't know what it was yet. He told himself he wasn't sure he wanted to. But he stayed until 11:15, the latest he'd stayed anywhere that wasn't work in longer than he could remember. And when he finally left, the rain had softened to a mist, and his jacket pocket still held a folded cocktail napkin that he would eventually throw away, but not yet. Not tonight. November came in cold and gray, the way it always did in Bellhaven, not dramatically. Not storms or spectacle, just a gradual lowering of the sky until the city felt like it was living under a lid. The leaves finished falling, the tourists stopped coming, and the streets took on that particular quality of Pacific Northwest winter, quiet and slightly damp and somehow more honest than any other season. Gideon and Octavia had now shared 4 Friday evenings at the Hawthorne Room, and neither of them had done anything so clumsy as to define what they were doing. This suited Gideon fine. Definition required intention, and intention required a kind of emotional exposure he hadn't attempted in years. It was enough, for now, to have somewhere to be on Friday nights that felt different from the rest of his week. It was enough to have someone who asked him real questions and then actually waited for the answers. What he knew about her, assembled over 4 weeks, was limited but not nothing. She'd grown up in Portland, moved to Bellhaven in her late 20s. She traveled frequently Chicago, New York, occasionally overseas. She had a daughter from a marriage that had ended a long time ago, a daughter who was now 26 and lived in London and called on Sundays when she remembered. She preferred whiskey to wine but drank it slowly. She read 3 newspapers a day and found most of them depressing. She had very little patience for people who confused confidence with volume. She had not mentioned what she did for work, and he hadn't asked directly. He got the impression she was in business of some kind investment, maybe, or consulting. She spoke about boardrooms and quarterly projections with the casual familiarity of someone who spent real time in them. She used the word capital the way most people use the word money, which is to say unselfconsciously. He assumed she was successful. He did not assume the scale of it. That came later. It came at Marcus Webb's going-away party on the 2nd Thursday of November. Marcus was the Register's longtime political correspondent, 61 years old, and he was leaving because the paper had quietly offered him a buyout and he'd been smart enough to take it. His farewell party was held at a slightly nicer bar than the staff usually frequented, a place called Archer and Wren on the east side of downtown, because Marcus had insisted on it and threatened to uninvite the publisher if he complained about the tab. Gideon went, because Marcus had been one of the few people at the Register who actually remembered his name consistently. He didn't stay long at these things, as a rule. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from newsroom social events, where the conversation was either about the industry dying or about whose story got the most clicks last month, but he felt he owed Marcus at least an hour. He was 40 minutes in, holding a beer he mostly wasn't drinking, when he saw her across the room. He registered it the way you register an unexpected sound, a slight internal shift, a reorientation. She was standing near the far windows with 2 other people he didn't recognize, a man in his 60s and a woman around 40, both of them in the kind of clothing that suggested they weren't journalists. Octavia was in a dark green jacket he hadn't seen before, and she was listening to something the older man was saying with the particular expression she had when she was deciding whether to bother responding. He hadn't moved toward her or away when she looked up and saw him. Something crossed her face. Not surprise exactly. More like the expression of someone who is mentally prepared for a conversation that is arriving ahead of schedule. She said something brief to the 2 people she was with, and then she crossed the room toward him.
You knew Marcus Webb?
He asked when she was close enough. I've known Marcus for 15 years, she said. He covered a story about one of my companies in 2009. Got most of it right, which was unusual enough that I took him to lunch afterward. Gideon looked at her. One of your companies.
How many companies do you have?
She studied him for a moment with the same expression she'd had that first night when she was deciding whether to move seats. Then she said simply several. That's not an answer. No, she agreed. It's not. He waited. I own a media group, she said. Among other things. Publishing some digital properties, a trade magazine portfolio. And then some investments outside that real estate. A biotech stake that I'm honestly starting to regret. A logistics company that's doing better than expected. She paused. It's more than I intended when I was young, and less than people assume when they first hear about it. How much more than you intended? He asked carefully. She looked at him steadily. Gideon, I'm worth somewhere north of $3 billion, depending on the quarter. He heard it. He processed it. He stood there for a moment, holding his beer. Okay, he said. Okay, I don't know what you expected me to say. Most people say something closer to either reverence or resentment, she said. Yours is the first okay I've received. I'm surprised, he said honestly. I knew you were successful. I didn't know. He stopped. The scale of it. Yeah, she watched him. Does it change something? He thought about that genuinely, which she seemed to notice and appreciate. "I don't know yet," he said. "Ask me in an hour." The corner of her mouth moved. Fair enough. They were standing near one of the high tables along the wall when the man she'd been talking to earlier came over. He was the kind of man who carried his own height like a personal achievement, broad-shouldered, well-dressed in an expensive and slightly showy way, with silver hair that he'd clearly tended to, and a smile that arrived on his face about a half-second before anything genuine could have produced it. "Octavia," he said, with the warmth of someone performing warmth. "I didn't realize you'd brought company." "I didn't," she said. "We already knew each other." The man glanced at Gideon with the kind of assessment that took about 2 seconds and clearly arrived at a conclusion. "Right, and what is it you do?" "Editor," Gideon said. "At the Register." "Ah, the syllable did a lot of work." "Brave field to stay in. I've heard that before." The man Gideon gathered his name was Harlan Price. From something Octavia said, smiled at this, and then turned his attention back to Octavia with the ease of someone who considered the prior conversation concluded. "You know, I was telling Sylvia earlier, it's remarkable what you've built." "Really is. Especially given everything." He paused, and the pause had intention in it. "The divorce, starting over at, what was it, 42? That's not easy. Not for anyone, but particularly, at that stage." "I was 43, Octavia said, "and I didn't start over. I accelerated, of course. Harlan smiled again. "I just mean it's admirable. A woman in your position, still at the table, still relevant. That takes work." "It does," she said, and her voice was perfectly level, which Gideon was beginning to understand was a sign of something specific. "It also helps to not spend energy on the opinions of people who confuse visibility with accomplishment." Harlan's smile held, but something behind his eyes shifted. He glanced at Gideon again, and this time the assessment was less casual. "And what about you? Is this a professional interest? I imagine Octavia's story would make good copy." "I'm here for Marcus Webb's send-off," Gideon said. "Same as everyone else." "Right." Harlan looked between them with an expression that was attempting to read as benign curiosity. "Just you know how it is. Woman of Octavia's profile, someone new in the picture. People wonder what the angle is." "No offense." There was a short silence. Gideon set his beer down on the table. "She was doing fine before you decided her life needed your opinion," he said. Harlan blinked. "I think you were on your way somewhere," Gideon added. It was said quietly, without heat, the way you state a fact about geography. Harlan looked at Octavia. She looked back at him with an expression of complete neutrality. He produced another version of the smile, murmured something about finding Sylvia, and left. The silence he left behind lasted about 5 seconds. "That was either very stupid or very kind," Octavia said. "I'm not sure which. Probably both," Gideon admitted. "He's the kind of man who doesn't forget things like that. He's the kind of man I've been managing for 20 years. She picked up her drink. "You didn't have to do that, I know. Most men either ignore it or make it worse by trying to be visibly outraged on my behalf." "I'm not outraged," he said. "I just don't have a lot of patience for people who dress contempt up as compliments." She looked at him for a moment, with an expression he was starting to recognize the one where she was revising something she'd previously thought. "No," she said. "Neither do I." They left the party around 9:30, within a few minutes of each other, and by no prior arrangement ended up walking in the same direction because they both lived on the west side of downtown. The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that cleaned the air and made the streetlights look sharper, and they walked for a block without saying much before Octavia said, "You're still thinking about the $3 billion. "I'm thinking about what it means that you didn't tell me," he said. "What does it mean?" "I don't know. Either you wanted someone to talk to without that information in the room, or you were testing something." "The first one," she said, without hesitation. "I wasn't testing anything. I get enough of that at work." She tucked her hands into her coat pockets. When you know what someone's worth before you know anything else about them, it changes everything. The conversation you have with them is never quite the conversation you'd have if you didn't know. People get careful, or they get hungry. Both are exhausting. "And with me, you wanted to know whether drinking alone was a choice," she said. "Not what I was worth. I didn't know you had a worth to ask about." "Exactly." He thought about this. "What if I'd been different once you found out?" "Then I'd have found out something useful," she said. "But I didn't think you would be." "Why not?" She glanced at him sideways. Because you looked at me the same way after as before, which is rarer than it sounds. They stopped at the corner of Callaway and 4th, which was where their routes diverged. The light at the intersection cycled through for a pedestrian who wasn't there. For what it's worth, he said, it doesn't change much for me. The number. No, I mean, it's a lot to process. I won't pretend it isn't, but it's yours. It doesn't tell me anything about whether you're worth spending a Friday evening with. She was quiet for a moment. The light changed again. That's the most reasonable thing anyone's said to me about money in years, she said. Reasonable's a low bar. You'd be surprised. He smiled. She almost did. You should get home, he said. It's cold. So should you? Yeah. He didn't move immediately. I told you I have a daughter, Elsie, she said. 9 years old. I'm not saying this to explain myself. I just want you to know it's the reason I'm careful. He looked at the intersection, not at her. Not of you specifically, of anything that takes up space in my life. Because it's not just my life anymore, and I forget that sometimes, but she never does. Octavia was quiet long enough that he wondered if he'd said too much. Then she said, how old was she when her mother left? 6. Old enough to notice, young enough to still believe it might reverse. He looked at her. Yeah, exactly that. I have a daughter too, she said. She was 14 when her father and I divorced. Old enough to understand everything and too young to handle it. She handled it by deciding I'd chosen work over family, and the version of that story she told herself has been pretty fixed ever since. She said it without drama. The way someone recites something they've recited a lot, internally, in the dark. I don't know if I made the right calls. I made the ones I could see at the time. Do you think about it? Every day. She shifted her weight. That's not self-pity. It's just accurate. I know, he said. I have the same thought about Elsie most mornings. Whether I'm doing enough, whether she's getting what she needs from me, whether what she needs from me is something I'm actually capable of giving. He paused. I've gotten pretty good at not finishing that thought. Same. The light changed a third time. Good night, Gideon, she said. Night, Octavia. He watched her walk south on 4th until she was half a block away. Then he turned and headed home. After that night, the shape of things changed between them, not dramatically, not with any declaration, but in the way that a room changes when a window is opened. Some of the careful distance went out of it. The conversations became longer. The Friday nights at the Hawthorne Room started earlier and ended later. She texted him the following Monday. Just a short message, thought about what you said. The part about not finishing the thought. I've started finishing them. It's deeply unpleasant, possibly useful. He read it twice on his phone in the newsroom and then wrote back, sorry. Did not mean to ruin an efficient coping mechanism. Yes, you did, she replied. Little bit, he admitted. She sent him a photograph later that week, not of herself, but of a page from a book she was reading, a dense economic history of the post-war publishing industry, with a single line underlined in pencil, the things we build often outlast our reasons for building them. Below it, she'd written, this made me think of the Register. He wrote back, the Register will probably outlast all of us. Not out of quality, but out of sheer refusal to acknowledge circumstances. Sounds like someone else I know, she wrote. He didn't respond to that one. But he kept the text. They talked about Elsie more over the weeks that followed. He told her about the beetle collection, 17 species, carefully pinned and labeled on foam boards that Elsie stored under her bed and brought out for guests, whether they wanted to see them or not. He told her about the morning Elsie had found an unusually large ground beetle in the parking lot behind their building and had been so excited she dropped her backpack and her lunch bag simultaneously and lost her. Sandwich under a dumpster and hadn't cared at all. He told her about the way Elsie still climbed into his bed some mornings before school, not because she was scared, just because she wanted to be near him, and how he pretended to be annoyed by this and was not even slightly annoyed. Octavia listened to all of it with a quality of attention he wasn't used to. Not the polite, waiting for her turn listening that passed for most conversations. Actual attention, the kind where she asked specific follow-up questions afterward, where she remembered the things he'd said weeks earlier and came back to them. In return, she told him about the company. Not the financial architecture of it, she seemed to sense that would land between them like a dropped weight, but the texture of running it. The meetings that went nowhere. The executives who were brilliant in their domains and catastrophically bad at anything requiring self-awareness. The particular loneliness of being the person in the room whose opinion is final, which sounds like power and is partly power, and is also partly a different kind of isolation. "Nobody argues with me anymore," she said one Friday, midway through November. Not really. They disagree with their body language and agree with their mouths, and you'd think after 20 years I'd be immune to it, but it still does something to me every time. "Makes you feel like you're lying to yourself," he said. Something like that. Like you're making decisions inside an echo chamber that everyone keeps telling you is the open air. "What do you do about it?" "I hire people who are willing to tell me I'm wrong," she said. "I pay them specifically for that. It works partially." She turned her glass in slow circles on the bar. "It's not the same as someone doing it for free." He understood that. More than he said. But she seemed to understand that he understood it, which was part of what made these Friday nights what they were. He told her, carefully, about the manuscript. The novel he'd started 4 years ago and abandoned 2 years later. Not because he'd decided it was bad, though maybe it was, but because the act of working on something that was entirely his, with no guaranteed outcome, had started to feel irresponsible. Like a luxury he hadn't earned. "What's it about?" she asked. He looked at his glass. A man trying to figure out the difference between the life he's built and the life he actually wanted. She was quiet for a moment. "How far did you get?" 140 pages. Rough ones. "Have you read them since?" "No." "Why not?" "Because if they're better than I remember, then I'm going to feel worse about stopping. And if they're worse, then I'm going to feel like the version of myself that wrote them was fooling himself." He shrugged. It was an honest shrug, not a dismissive one. "Either way, I lose something. Or you gain information," she said, "about what to do next." "I'm an editor," he said. "Information is how I avoid making decisions." She laughed at that, a real laugh, short and sudden, the kind that surprised her. He was starting to catalog those laughs. There weren't many of them, and each one felt like something that had to be earned. December came. The Friday nights continued. The texts continued. Once on a Tuesday, when Elsie was at her grandmother's and Gideon was at the newsroom at 2 in the morning, catching an error in a front-page headline, his phone lit up with a message from Octavia, still awake. "Q4 review going badly. Tell me something that has nothing to do with money." He'd thought for a moment, then written, "Elsie informed me tonight that the Hercules beetle can carry 850 times its own body weight. I've been thinking about that for 3 hours." There was a pause of about 4 minutes. "That's the most comforting thing I've heard all week," she wrote back. "Why?" "Because something that small can carry that much," she said. "And it doesn't seem to mind." He sat with that in the empty newsroom, the scanner running in the background, the city outside dark and cold and indifferent, and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for and wasn't ready to name anyway. The thing about keeping something at a careful distance is that the effort eventually becomes visible. You can manage it for a while, the controlled Friday evenings, the texts that stopped just short of something more, the conversations that went deep but not past a certain point, but sooner or later, the management itself becomes a kind of statement. He knew it. He suspected she did too. What he hadn't expected was for it to be made visible from the outside first. It was the last Friday of November, and they'd been at the Hawthorne Room for almost 2 hours, longer than either of them usually stayed, because they'd gotten into a conversation about what it meant to be satisfied with your life versus what it meant to have simply stopped measuring, and it had turned into the kind of conversation that was hard to interrupt. They were still talking when 2 women Gideon vaguely recognized from somewhere sat down at the near end of the bar. He didn't think much of it. The bar was filling up. He went back to what Octavia was saying about the difference between ambition and appetite. 20 minutes later, when he and Octavia were getting their coats, he caught a fragment of what the 2 women were saying. He didn't catch all of it. He caught enough. "That's Octavia Bellrose, I'm sure of it. Wonder who he is. She usually doesn't bit young for her, isn't he?" He said nothing. He didn't look over. They walked out into the cold together, and he told himself it didn't matter, and almost believed it. But on the sidewalk, after a pause in the conversation, Octavia said, "You heard them." "Doesn't matter," he said. "It bothered you." "Not the way you're probably thinking," he said. He stopped walking. The street was quiet. A car went past, headlights sweeping the wet pavement. It bothered me because it was the first time I thought about what this looks like from the outside. And I realized I hadn't thought about it at all, which might mean I've been careless. About what? He looked at her directly. About what I'm doing. What this is. Because it's one thing for me to be careless with my own feelings. I've been doing that for years. I'm pretty good at it. But I told you, it's not just my life. She was quiet for a long moment, the cold turning their breath to mist between them. Then she said, "Is that your way of saying you need to slow down?" He thought about it. He thought about Elsie, asleep right now at his mother's house, who had no idea any of this was happening, who trusted him completely and without reservation, the way children trust the adults, who've never given them reason not to. He thought about the cocktail napkin he'd thrown away 3 weeks ago. He thought about the manuscript on his hard drive. "It's my way of saying I need to be honest about what this already is," he said, "before it gets further." Octavia held his eyes. "And what is it?" she asked. Her voice was even, but the question wasn't casual. He didn't answer immediately. He let the silence sit, because it was an honest silence, not a hedging one. "More than I planned for," he said finally. She nodded once. Slowly, like that answered something she'd been waiting to know. "More than I planned for either," she said, "for whatever that's worth." He looked at her for a moment, this woman who'd built something extraordinary and sat alone at the end of bars and asked strangers whether being alone was a choice and felt the full weight of what was developing between them. Not as something frightening exactly, but as something that deserved to be carried carefully. "It's worth something," he said. "I just need to figure out how to hold it right." She didn't push. She didn't offer a solution or a reassurance. She simply said, "Okay," in that way she had of making the word mean more than its size, and they walked the rest of the way to the corner of Calloway and Fourth, and said good night, and went their separate ways in the cold. He walked home slowly. He unlocked his apartment, left his coat on the hook by the door, and sat down at the kitchen table in the dark for a few minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, and thinking about everything at once. Then he opened his laptop, navigated to the folder he hadn't opened in 2 years, and stared at the manuscript file without clicking it. He didn't open it that night, but he didn't close the laptop either. He went to bed with the screen still glowing in the other room, and he slept better than he had in months, and he wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but he thought cautiously, quietly. The way you think about things you don't want to jinx that it might mean something worth paying attention to. He opened the manuscript on a Tuesday night in early December, 3 days after the conversation on the corner of Calloway and Fourth. He hadn't planned to. He'd sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee and his work bag, and a genuine intention to review a feature piece due the next morning, and then somehow his hands had navigated to the wrong folder, and there it was, draft novel V7 final reel. Docs sitting on his screen like something that had been waiting patiently for him to stop being afraid of it. He read for an hour and 40 minutes without stopping. It was not as bad as he'd feared. It was also not as good as the version he'd constructed in his memory during the years of not looking at it, which was somehow worse, because the memory version had been either brilliantly salvageable or completely hopeless, and either extreme would have given him permission to keep doing nothing. This was neither. This was 140 pages of a man writing at the edge of what he could do, reaching for something he could almost see, getting it right in places and missing badly in others. And the combination of those two things, the reaching and the missing, was the most honest thing he'd read in years. He closed the laptop at 2 a.m. and sat in the dark for a while. He texted Octavia, "Read the manuscript." She replied 11 minutes later, which meant she was awake, which he'd started to accept as her natural state during the week. "And it's not finished," he wrote. "But it's not nothing either." There was a pause. Then no, I didn't think it would be. He put his phone face down on the table and went to bed, and lay there thinking about the 140 pages for a long time before he slept. And in the morning he got up and made breakfast for Elsie and listened to 14 minutes of information about the differences between scarab beetles and dung beetles, which were apparently not the same thing, and he'd been wrong to assume they were. And he drove her to school and came home and opened the manuscript again and wrote 3 new pages before he went to sleep for the day. He didn't tell anyone at work. He didn't tell his mother. He told Octavia in the way that you tell someone about something that matters when you've decided they're allowed to know about things that matter, not with a formal announcement, but in the small daily accumulation of updates, the kind that build up gradually until they constitute a form of intimacy neither party explicitly agreed to. She asked good questions. She didn't flatter him. When he shared a paragraph he'd revised 4 times and was still unsure about, she read it and wrote back. The second sentence is doing too much. Cut the last clause. The image is already there. He read the paragraph again. She was right. He didn't tell her she was right because she clearly already knew it. You've read manuscripts before, he wrote instead. I own 4 publishing imprints, she replied. I've read approximately 9,000 manuscripts. Most of them badly. Is mine bad? A pause longer than the others. It's honest. That's rarer and more useful than good. He kept writing. Christmas approached with its usual combination of obligation and genuine warmth, and Belhaven put up its lights and its wreaths, and the Register ran its annual holiday content that everyone wrote on autopilot, and everyone read exactly as much as they needed to, and no more. Gideon's mother took Elsie to pick out a tree, and Elsie insisted on the largest one that would fit through the apartment doorway, which turned out to be a matter of some genuine negotiation, and they got it home in the back of a borrowed truck and spent 2 hours decorating it while Elsie narrated the significance of each ornament with the thoroughness of a museum curator. He and Octavia did not exchange gifts. This was not a decision they made explicitly. It was more that the question never quite arose, and in not arising it established something. They were not yet in the territory of gifts. They were in the territory of texts at odd hours and Friday evenings, and a conversation that kept deepening in ways neither of them fully controlled. What did happen the Friday before Christmas was that Octavia arrived at the Hawthorne room 20 minutes later than usual and sat down and ordered without taking off her coat, which she always did, and Gideon looked at her and said, "What happened?" "Nothing catastrophic," she said. "Quarterly board meeting. One of my executives, the biotech stake I mentioned, the one I'm regretting, has decided that the reason the investment is underperforming is because I've been distracted." "Has he said that to your face?" "He said it in a meeting with 11 other people, which is a particular kind of cowardice dressed up as transparency." She took off her coat finally and folded it over the back of her chair with more precision than the action required. "He's not wrong that it's underperforming. He's wrong about the reason." "What's the actual reason?" "Market conditions and a leadership team that can't make a decision without committee consensus on every minor variable." She picked up her glass. "But I should have caught that earlier. I didn't pay close enough attention in the due diligence phase." "So he's half right," Gideon said. She looked at him. "Yes, and that's the part that's bothering you." "The part that's bothering me," she said carefully, "is that he said it in front of 11 people, and he said it with a very specific kind of confidence that told me he'd been building toward saying it for a while, which means he's been talking about it when I'm not in the room. And I don't know what else that conversation sounds like when I'm not there to hear it." Gideon nodded. He understood institutional politics well enough. He'd watched editors get quietly marginalized at the Register for years, the way it happened in any organization, not with confrontation but with slow erosion, the gradually shrinking sphere of decisions you were consulted on. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to let him make his case formally," she said. "Give him the meeting he clearly wants. Let him say all of it in a room where there are consequences for being wrong. And if he's not wrong, then I'll deal with that too." She said it flatly, without the energy of performance. "I've been dealing with things I didn't plan for since I was 29 years old. I'm not going to collapse because a junior executive decided to make a play." She said it like a simple statement of fact. And that was the thing about Octavia Bellrose that Gideon had been slowly understanding over these months. She wasn't brittle. Whatever she'd been through, and he suspected it was considerably more than she'd described, it hadn't made her brittle. It had made her dense, in the geological sense, compressed by pressure into something harder than what she'd started as. Not impervious, she wasn't impervious. He'd seen the edges of where she wasn't but solid, in a way that was real rather than performed. "You're not distracted," he said. She looked at him. "No, not in the way he means." Gideon turned his glass slowly. "Distracted would mean you're not thinking about the work. You clearly are. What you are maybe is thinking about more than just the work, which is different." She was quiet for a moment. The bar was warm. The rain had started up again outside, and somewhere behind them, 2 people were arguing cheerfully about a basketball game. That's a generous interpretation, she said. It's an accurate one, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he was beginning to know well, the one where she was deciding how much to say. I think about the Friday nights during the week now, she said. More than I should, probably, given my schedule. He didn't say anything. I think about what we'll talk about, she continued carefully. What you'll say to whatever I bring up, whether you'll push back or agree. I find myself constructing arguments in my head to see what you'd say to them. A short pause. That hasn't happened to me in a long time. Since when? He asked. Since my marriage was good, she said, which was a while ago. Another pause. I don't say that to make it more than it is. I just wanted to say it because I'm tired of not saying things. Gideon absorbed this. He was aware that what he said next mattered, and he was aware that being aware of this was already a kind of answer. I think about them too, he said. The Fridays. He looked at her directly. I started counting down to them sometime in November. I noticed that I'd started, and I thought about whether I should stop, and decided I didn't want to. The rain hit the windows harder. Carl moved down the bar, giving them the efficient non-attention of a good bartender. Is that what this is? Octavia asked. It wasn't quite the question yet, but it was close. I don't know what to call it, he said. I know what it feels like. What does it feel like? He thought about how to answer honestly without hiding inside the honesty. Like something I haven't felt in long enough that I almost didn't recognize it at first. And then I did recognize it. And then I spent about 3 weeks telling myself I was misreading the situation. She said nothing. She was holding his eyes very still. I wasn't misreading it, he said. The silence between them was the kind that has weight. Not uncomfortable weight, the other kind. The weight of something real being acknowledged by two people at the same time. No, she said finally. You weren't, he exhaled. Okay, she agreed. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she said, I've been waiting for you to stop performing uncertainty for about 3 weeks. Was it that obvious? To me, yes. You'd gotten very precise about not saying specific things. Which, for someone who edits text for a living, is pretty telling. He almost smiled. That's fair. The 15 years, she said. It wasn't a question, but it had the shape of one. Yeah. Is that she stopped? Started again. Is that the actual thing, or is it a convenient thing to point at? He appreciated that she asked it directly. Honest answer? Always. Both, he said. It's a real thing. The math of it is real where you are in your life, where I am, what that means in 20 years. I think about that. He paused. But I also know myself well enough to know I'd have found something to be cautious about regardless. If it wasn't the age difference, it would be the money. If it wasn't the money, it would be something else. 'Cause you're careful. Because I'm scared, he corrected. Careful is the word I use. But it's scared. Something shifted in her expression. Not pity, she wasn't the pity kind, and he would have resented it if she were. Something more like recognition. Of what specifically? She asked. Elsie, he said without hesitation, everything else is manageable. The age gap, the money, what people think I can absorb all of that. What I can't absorb is her. He looked down at his glass and then back up. She lost her mother's daily presence when she was 6. She rebuilt herself around me and her grandmother and her Beatles and the very specific structure of her life. If I let someone in and it doesn't work, if I let her get attached and then it doesn't work, he stopped. You can't guarantee it works, Octavia said quietly.
No, nobody can, I know that.
He ran a hand over his jaw. I know that intellectually. It doesn't help. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain intensified, then eased. I'm not going to tell you the risk isn't there, she said. I have enough respect for you not to do that. It is there. Everything real involves that risk. I know. What I can tell you, she said, is that I'm not someone who enters into things carelessly. I've been careful my whole adult life, sometimes to my detriment. She paused. I'm not reckless with things that matter. I know that too. Then what do you need? She asked. And it was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. She actually wanted the answer. He sat with it for a long moment. The bar had filled while they weren't paying attention. And the sound around them had risen, and somewhere behind them someone laughed at something loudly, and then apologized for the volume. And the whole ordinary human texture of the place held them without comment. I need to not pretend I know where this goes, he said finally. I need to not make promises I can't keep about what it turns into. I need it to be allowed to be uncertain, at least at the beginning. That's the only honest way anything begins, she said. He looked at her. Yeah, so. She picked up her glass. Set it down. Can we agree that it's begun? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, yeah, he said. I think it began a while ago, actually. October, she said. October, he agreed. Something settled between them. Not perfectly nothing. Between two people who were both carrying the weight of their respective histories settles perfectly but genuinely. Like a key turning in a lock that had been stiff for a very long time. January in Belhaven was the city's least attractive month, gray and relentless, and somehow longer than its 31 days suggested. And Gideon moved through it with the particular sensation of a man whose internal landscape has shifted while his external one remained identical. He still worked nights. He still picked Elsie up at 3:15. He still ate standing over the sink more often than he should. But he was writing. Really writing, not the tentative 3 pages he'd allowed himself in December, but full sessions of 2 and sometimes 3 hours before work, sitting at the kitchen table after Elsie was asleep, the apartment quiet around him, the manuscript growing page by page into something that was beginning to have the shape of a complete thing. He and Octavia texted every day now. Not constantly she was busy, he was busy, and there was something about the discipline of their contact that felt right. Like they'd both decided independently that whatever this was should develop at a pace that matched its weight rather than its momentum. But every day something. A sentence about work, a question about Elsie, a photograph of something one of them had seen that seemed to belong in the other's day. She sent him a photograph of a first edition she'd found in a bookshop in New York during a business trip in January, The Moviegoer by Walker Percy, the spine faded but intact. Thought of you, she wrote. He was also a man who had trouble deciding what he wanted. He wrote back, did he figure it out? Read it and tell me, she said. He bought his own copy at the used bookshop on Henderson Street, read it over the next 2 weeks in the hours between dropping Elsie at school and going to sleep, and when he finished it, he texted Octavia. He figured out that the question was the wrong one. Yes, she wrote back immediately. Exactly. The Friday evenings continued, but they'd begun to change shape. In January, they walked after the bar not every time, but often, through the cold streets of the West Side, past the lit windows of other people's evenings, the kind of walking that has no destination and doesn't need one. They talked, and sometimes they didn't, and both were comfortable. He told her more about his marriage. Not the post-mortem version he'd refined over 3 years into something clean and compartmentalized, but the actual version, the slow leak of it, the way he and Dana had been good at the surface maintenance of a partnership and bad at the deeper architecture. The way they'd both known for about a year before either of them said anything. The strange grief of ending something that hadn't dramatically failed, but had simply run out of whatever made it run. I was angry for a while, he said. Not at her specifically. At the situation. At the fact that I was 30 years old with a 6-year-old daughter and a life that had just rearranged itself without my permission. What did you do with the anger? Worked, he said. Slept badly. Picked up Elsie from school every day and made dinner every night and did all the necessary external things. Because the external things were what Elsie needed and doing them was something I could control. And the internal things? Mostly stopped paying attention to them, he admitted. Which worked, functionally, for about 2 years. And then you sat down at a bar and asked me if drinking alone was by choice. And apparently that was enough to crack the whole system. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. I didn't intend to be disruptive. I know. That's probably why it worked. He looked at her. If you'd been trying to get my attention, I'd have get my attention, been much more guarded about it. I've noticed that about you, she said. You're suspicious of things that come at you directly. Occupational habit, he said. I spend my nights looking for the word that's trying to do something it hasn't earned the right to do. And in conversation, same thing. She nodded. I'm the opposite. I prefer direct. It's more efficient, he agreed, but it misses things. Some things only come out sideways. She was quiet for a moment. Like tonight, she said. Like a lot of nights, he said. February arrived, and with it a specific development that Gideon had been circling without allowing himself to fully approach. Octavia had mentioned once, in December, that she'd never met Elsie. She'd said it not as a request, but as an observation, the way she made most of her observations plainly. without maneuvering. He'd heard it, acknowledged it, and then carefully not responded to it. And she, to her credit, had not pushed. But the mention had done what mentions do when you let them sit. It had grown roots. He thought about it a lot in January. He thought about what it would mean and what it would require, and all the things that could go wrong, because that was how he approached everything, by itemizing the risk before he could let himself account for the possibility. And there were real risks. Elsie was not a complicated child in terms of emotional needs, but she was attentive in the way smart children are attentive. She noticed things. She would notice if this was something important. She would decide accordingly. And once Elsie decided something, she held to it with the same total commitment she applied to Beatles. What he kept coming back to, in the late-night kitchen table hours while the manuscript grew, and the apartment settled into its winter quiet around him, was something Octavia had said back in November about her own daughter, about the version of a story a child constructs and holds fixed. He didn't want to be so afraid of a bad outcome for Elsie that he ended up building one, by default a life that was so carefully sealed against risk that there was no room in it for anything unexpected to come in and be good. He called his mother on a Sunday in early February, which was their usual Sunday call time, and his mother, who was 71 and had stopped performing delicacy about her opinions somewhere around her 65th birthday, said, "You sound different." Different how? Like you've been thinking about something for a long time, and you've almost finished thinking about it. He considered this. Maybe. Is it a person? Mom, Gideon. Yes, he said. It's a person. A pause. Is she good to you? She's honest with me. I think that's better. Another pause. Longer. His mother had raised him partly alone, his father having left when Gideon was 11, and she had opinions about what good looked like in a relationship that came from having seen its absence up close. Does Elsie know about her? Not yet. Are you going to tell her? He looked out the kitchen window at the February sky, flat and pale and going nowhere. I'm working up to it, he said. Don't work up to it too long, his mother said. Children figure things out faster than we think they do. He told Elsie's on a Wednesday evening in mid-February, while she was supposed to be doing her homework, but was actually examining something small and dark through her magnifying glass at the kitchen table. Hey, he said. He sat down across from her. She looked up with the slightly unfocused expression of someone returning from a significant distance. Can I tell you about something? Is it bad? She asked immediately. No, he said. It's not bad. She considered this with visible deliberation. Is it about school? It's about me, he said. About I've been spending some time with someone. A woman I met a few months ago. Elsie set down her magnifying glass. Her full attention when she chose to deploy it was slightly unnerving. She looked at you the way she looked at Beatles, with a complete and unsentimental curiosity. Like a girlfriend? She asked. Like someone I've been getting to know, he said carefully. And I wanted to tell you about it. She thought about this. What's her name? Octavia. That's an unusual name, Elsie said, neither positively nor negatively. Yeah, she's an unusual person. Is she nice? She's smart, he said. And she's honest. Those things tend to make people seem less nice than they are. But he paused. I think you'd have opinions about her. Would my opinions be right? Probably, he said. Elsie picked up her magnifying glass again, then put it down again. Are you happy? She asked. The question was so direct and so genuinely curious that it stopped him. 9 years old, and she knew which question was actually the relevant one. I think I'm getting there, he said. She absorbed this with the seriousness it deserved. Okay, she said finally. You can tell me more stuff when there's more stuff to tell. That's it? I'm not done thinking about it, she said. I'll tell you when I'm done thinking about it. She picked up her magnifying glass and went back to whatever was under it, and Gideon sat across from her for a moment, feeling the specific quality of love he had, for this particular person, the kind that was made of everything. The exhaustion and the guilt and the pride and the fear and the Wednesday evening homework table and the Beatle sex and all of it, and felt it more sharply than he had in a long time, which he understood was because happiness, when it actually arrives, has a way of making the things you already love feel suddenly more vivid. The Friday after Valentine's Day, he arrived at the Hawthorne Room first for the first time. He ordered his usual whiskey and sat in their usual spot. They had a usual spot now, end of the bar closest to the window, which allowed for a view of the street while still being far enough from the door to not get hit with cold every time someone came in and waited. She arrived 7 minutes later, shaking rain off her coat, and sat down beside him. And Carl had her drink in front of her before she'd finished settling, because Carl had started doing that sometime in December without being asked, which was either good service or a form of commentary. I told Elsie about you, he said. Octavia's hand stopped on her glass. When? Wednesday. What did she say? She said she'd tell me when she was done thinking about it. He looked at Octavia. She hasn't told me yet, which means she's still processing. Is that good or bad? With Elsie, it's thorough, he said, which is usually better than a fast answer. Octavia was quiet for a moment. Are you sure about this? About telling her? About all of it. He thought about Elsie at the kitchen table with her magnifying glass. He thought about the manuscript, now 212 pages and still going. He thought about October and the cocktail napkin and the corner of Callaway and Fourth and the walk in the cold and the text about the Hercules beetle. Are you? He asked. She looked at him steadily. I asked you first. I know. He picked up his glass. Outside, the rain came down properly now, the way February rain does in Belhaven, without apology, without expectation of sympathy. The window filmed over. The street went to gold and gray smears. Inside, the Hawthorne room held them the way it always did, warmly and without judgment. Yeah, he said, I'm sure. She reached across the bar and put her hand over his. Not a gesture with agenda behind it, not calculated, just a hand on his hand, warm and actual. So am I, she said. He looked down at their hands for a moment. He thought about all the things still unresolved, the age gap, the money, Elsie's still forming opinion, the manuscript he hadn't finished, the window in his apartment that still wouldn't close properly. He thought about how none of those things had been resolved, and how that was entirely the point, and how the woman sitting beside him was someone who understood that reality wasn't a problem to be solved, but a thing to be moved through, steadily, with another person, if you were lucky enough to find one worth moving through it with. He turned his hand over under hers. Is this still your Friday choice? He said. It was an echo of what she'd asked him, once, obliquely, that first night, whether being alone was a choice. She understood immediately. Every part of it, she said. The rain came down outside, the bar was warm. And Gideon Fairmont, who had spent 3 years learning to want very little, sat with his hand in the hand of a woman he hadn't planned for, and felt the full, inconvenient, irreversible weight of having changed his mind. Elsie told him she was done thinking about it on a Saturday morning in late February, 11 days after he'd mentioned Octavia at the kitchen table. She came into the kitchen while he was making eggs, climbed onto the counter the way she'd been told not to do approximately 400 times, and said, I have questions. Gideon turned the burner down. Okay, how old is she? 50. Elsie processed this with visible calculation. That's 18 years older than you. 15. I said 18. 15, he repeated. I'm 32. She frowned. I thought you were 34. I turned 32 in October. You made me a birthday card with a drawing of either me and you or me and a tree. It was you and you, she said. I was trying to show that you're two different people on the inside and outside. A pause. It didn't come out right. I liked it anyway. Okay, but 15 years is still a lot. It's a number, he said. Numbers mean things, she said, which was so unarguably correct that he said nothing. She swung her legs against the cabinet below her. Is she nice? I told you she's honest and she's smart. Those things make people seem less nice than they are. You said that. She looked at the eggs. Can she cook? I don't know, he said honestly. We've never cooked together. Where do you usually go? A bar on Callaway Street. Elsie's expression shifted into the particular configuration she used when she had found something technically interesting. You see her at a bar every week? It's a nice bar. Quiet, no televisions. That's a weird place to fall in love, she said. The word landed in the kitchen with unexpected weight. He hadn't used that word, not to Elsie, not yet, not even entirely to himself in those precise terms. He stood at the stove looking at his 9-year-old daughter and found he had no clean response available. Who said anything about love? He said carefully. Elsie looked at him with the unsentimental patience of someone who had inherited his own professional habits, seeing what was actually on the page rather than what the writer wished was there. Dad, she said, Elsie. I'm 9, she said. I'm not a baby. I'm aware. You smile at your phone, she said. You've been writing again. You cleaned the apartment twice in 1 week in January. I'm not going to pretend I don't notice things. He turned back to the eggs because he needed somewhere to look. When did you get so observant? You taught me, she said simply. You always say look at what's actually there, not what you expect to see. He served the eggs onto 2 plates and brought them to the table, and they sat down, and Elsie ate with the focused efficiency she applied to most things she wasn't particularly interested in drawing out, and after a while she said, "Can I meet her?" He looked up. "Not like an introduction," she said quickly. "Not like a big thing. I just want to see what she's like. You can tell a lot about a person by how they act when it's not a big thing." He thought about this. "Where did you learn that?" "You again," she said, without looking up from her eggs. He sat with his coffee and looked at his daughter, who was 9 years old and had a beetle collection, and had apparently been paying more attention to him than he'd been paying to himself for the past several months, and felt the very particular helplessness of being known well by someone you love. "I'll see if she wants to," he said. "Okay." Elsie finished her eggs. "Also, the window in your room still doesn't close properly. You should fix that before it gets warm, because then bugs will get in, and I don't want them to get in because they should be outside, not in." "The window," he said. "You've been meaning to fix it since November," she said. "I'm just reminding you." He texted Octavia that afternoon, "Elsie has completed her analysis. She wants to meet you. Her preferred method is not a big thing. She was very specific about that." Octavia replied within 2 minutes, "She sounds like someone I'd respect." "She'll figure out whether to respect you too," he wrote. "She's thorough. Should I be nervous?" He considered this honestly. "Yes," he wrote. "A little." A pause. Then, "Good. I'd rather be nervous than complacent about it." They arranged it for the following Saturday, the first week of March. Not a dinner, not an introduction. Gideon took Elsie to the Natural History Museum on Clement Avenue, where the permanent insect exhibit was one of Elsie's established territories, and Octavia met them there at noon, with the explicit framing of having wanted to see the exhibit herself, which was believable enough that nobody had to perform anything. Gideon arrived with Elsie at 11:45, and they walked through the mineral gallery and part of the marine section, before Octavia came through the main entrance at 12:02, in jeans and a gray jacket. No blazer, no watch that cost more than most people's cars. She'd thought about that. He realized she'd thought about what to wear and what it communicated, and she'd made a choice. And that attention to what the situation actually required told him something important. Elsie saw her from across the room. She didn't say anything. She just looked, with the same complete assessment she gave to interesting specimens. Octavia walked over, and Gideon made the introduction, and Octavia said, "Hi, Elsie," without the excessive warmth that adults sometimes performed around children to compensate for not actually knowing what to say to them. "Hi," said Elsie. She looked at Octavia for another moment, then looked at her father, then back at Octavia. "Do you actually want to see the insect exhibit, or are you just here because of him?" "Elsie," Gideon said. "Both," Octavia said. "In that order, though exhibit first, because I've actually wanted to see it. They have a mounted specimen of Goliathus goliatus that's supposed to be unusually large." Elsie's entire posture changed. It was subtle, but Gideon knew it the way he knew everything about her, a slight forward lean, a specific quality of alertness. "The Goliath beetle," she said. "That's the heaviest beetle in the world. It can weigh up to 100 grams. 114 in some recorded cases," Octavia said. Elsie stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I looked it up," Octavia said. "I heard you were an expert, and I didn't want to come unprepared." A silence. Gideon did not hold his breath, but it was a near thing. "The one they have here is 87 grams, Elsie said finally. "I checked the placard 3 times because the first time I thought I'd misread it." "Is 87 grams impressive?" "Very," Elsie said. "I can show you." She turned and walked toward the insect gallery without waiting, because Elsie moved toward things she was interested in, without consulting anyone else's pace, and Octavia glanced at Gideon just once. A brief sideways look that contained a full sentence, something like, "Okay, I see what you mean," and then followed. Gideon followed both of them, 3 paces behind, and did not say a word for the better part of the next hour. What he observed in that hour was this: Octavia did not try. That was the thing. He'd been half braced for the version of this that went wrong, the performance of interest, the slightly too enthusiastic questions, the adult talking to a child in the exaggerated way that children find immediately and accurately condescending. He'd been afraid of it, not because he thought Octavia was that kind of person, but because she was walking into Elsie's territory without a map, and even good people made clumsy choices in unfamiliar terrain. But she didn't perform. She listened. When Elsie talked about the difference between the two preserved specimens of rhinoceros beetles, in the case one from Southeast Asia, one from Central America, and why the differences in horn structure were actually functional and not merely aesthetic, Octavia listened with the same quality of attention she gave to Gideon at the bar on Friday nights, the full-weight kind that was hard to fake. And when she asked questions, they were the questions of someone actually curious, not the questions of someone trying to appear curious. "Why does the horn structure matter functionally?" she asked. Elsie looked at her with surprise. Most adults asked easier questions. "For combat," she said. "Males use the horns to fight for mating rights. The leverage angle is different for different." She paused.
How much do you want me to explain?
"All of it," Octavia said. So Elsie explained all of it. In the focused and thorough way, she explained things when she trusted the audience, and Octavia absorbed it. And at a certain point, Gideon drifted back a step and stood against the wall of the exhibit hall and watched the two of them standing side by side at the display case, one 9 years old, one 50, separated by 4 decades and an incalculable difference in the world's understanding of their respective worth, and felt something in his chest that had no clean name but was warm and very slightly terrifying. They ate lunch in the museum cafe afterward, which was not particularly good food, but had a window that looked out onto the building's small interior courtyard where a single bare-limbed tree was beginning tentatively to bud. Elsie ate a grilled cheese and explained the organizational system of her beetle collection to Octavia, who asked whether the system was taxonomic or geographic, which was a question that delighted Elsie so completely that she put down her sandwich. "Both," she said. "I use taxonomic order as the primary, but within each family I organize by geographic origin because I think it's important to know where things come from." "That's a defensible archival logic," Octavia said. "That's what I thought," Elsie agreed. Gideon ate his soup and said almost nothing for 45 minutes. On the way out, while Elsie was in the bathroom, Octavia stood beside him at the museum entrance and said, quietly, "She's remarkable." "She is," he agreed. "She's also going to find out about the money at some point," Octavia said. "Kids look things up." He hadn't thought about that yet, which was an oversight. "Yeah," he said. "She will. I'd rather you tell her. When the time is right, then have her find it somewhere else and decide we were hiding something." He looked at her. The care in the suggestion, the specifically practical care, the kind that thought about Elsie's experience rather than anyone's image, was the kind of thing you couldn't perform convincingly. It either came from somewhere real or it didn't. "Okay," he said. "When the time is right." Elsie came back from the bathroom and collected her coat, and they walked out into the early March air, which was cold but had a different quality to it than February cold, something tentative in it, some first suggestion of what was coming after. At the sidewalk, Elsie looked at Octavia with the direct gravity that was her natural register. "You can come back," she said. "To the museum want." "I'd like that," Octavia said. Elsie nodded, as if this had confirmed something she'd suspected. Then she took Gideon's hand, something she didn't do as often at 9 as she had at 7, but still did, and he never commented on it, just held on, and they walked toward the parking structure, and Gideon glanced back once at Octavia, who was watching them go with an expression he'd never seen on her before. It took him a moment to identify it. Then he did. She looked like she'd been let in somewhere she'd been standing outside of for a very long time. Spring came to Belhaven the way it always did, not all at once, but incrementally, with setbacks, some genuinely cold weeks inserted into April, as if to remind everyone not to be too confident. But it came. The trees along Callaway Street went from bare to cautiously green. The days lengthened in a way that was noticeable by 5 in the afternoon, and Gideon found himself writing in actual daylight on weekends for the first time since autumn, sitting at the kitchen table while the sun came through the window that still didn't close properly and lit the pages of the manuscript in a way that felt, if not like a sign, then at least like a pleasant condition to work in. The manuscript was at 304 pages by the 1st of April. He'd stopped counting days and started counting pages sometime in March, which was either a sign of progress or a writer's superstition, he'd accidentally adopted. Either way, the story was taking shape, a real shape, with the structural integrity of something that was no longer searching for itself, but had found its spine and was building outward from there. He still hadn't told anyone at work. He wasn't sure why, exactly. It wasn't shame he'd moved past that fairly early. The old embarrassment of a grown man who edited other people's words by night and tried to make his own by day. It was more that the manuscript felt like something that existed in a separate compartment from his professional life, and letting those two things touch felt premature. Like introducing two people before you were sure they'd be good for each other. The Octavia situation at the register was, however, becoming difficult to contain. He'd managed, through the winter, to keep the two parts of his life cleanly separated. His colleagues at the newspaper knew he had a daughter, and almost nothing else about his personal life, which was how he preferred it. But newspapers, even dying ones, run on human curiosity as much as professional obligation, and a senior editor receiving texts at odd hours, with the specific quality of suppressed expression that Gideon had apparently been unable to control as reliably as he thought that was the kind of thing that got noticed. It was his colleague Priya who said something, on a Thursday night in early April, in the direct but kind way that Priya said most things. "You're seeing someone," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked up from the page he'd been reading. "What makes you say that?" "The fact that you've smiled at your phone 3 times in the last 2 hours," she said. "You're not usually a phone smiler. You treat your phone like a necessary inconvenience. I can smile at my phone. You physically grimaced at a notification last month," she said. "Whatever's changed has changed pretty significantly." He considered denying it and decided it wasn't worth the effort. "Yeah," he said. "I'm seeing someone." "Good," Priya said. "Anyone I'd know? Probably not." He paused. "Her name's Octavia. We met at the Hawthorne Room in October." Priya nodded with the equanimity of someone who filed new information efficiently. "Is it serious?" He thought about the museum, about Elsie's hand in his on the sidewalk, about Octavia's expression watching them walk away. "Getting there," he said. "Good," Priya said again and went back to her work. And that was the entirety of it, which was one of the things he valued about Priya. The first Friday in April, Octavia arrived at the Hawthorne Room before him. This had happened a handful of times before, but tonight she was sitting with a particular quality of distraction that he recognized from the November evening after the board meeting not quite here, still partly in whatever had occupied the hours before. He ordered, sat down, and waited. He'd learned her rhythms well enough by now to know that pushing tended to produce the opposite of the intended result, and that if he simply waited, she would find her own way to whatever she needed to say. She got there in about 10 minutes, which was quick. "I had a conversation today," she said, "with my daughter." He kept his expression neutral. He knew about the daughter Margot, 26, London, in the way he knew about most things in Octavia's life, assembled over months in pieces that were offered carefully and in sequence. The relationship was not broken, exactly, but it was strained in the way long-distance relationships with old injuries tend to be functional, occasionally warm, but carrying a load that neither party had fully agreed to set down. She called, Octavia continued. "Sunday call, except she called on Friday, because she's going somewhere this weekend and won't be available Sunday." She mentioned, in the normal flow of conversation, that she'd read an article. "About you? About me and my significant other," which was the phrase the article used. Octavia picked up her drink. Apparently a gossip column in one of the Bellhaven digital properties ran something last week. A paragraph about me being seen regularly with someone younger. No name but a description. Gideon absorbed this. How did Margot take it? She was careful, Octavia said. She's always careful now with me. She used to not be. We used to argue the way you argue when you actually believe the relationship can absorb it. Now she's careful, which is its own kind of distance. She set her glass down. She asked if I was happy. Directly, the way she used to ask things when she was younger. What did you say? I said yes. She paused. And then I said I wanted her to know about him, about you properly, from me, before she read anything else somewhere else. So I told her. Briefly, your name, your work, Elsie. He waited. She was quiet for a while, Octavia said. Then she said, is he good to you? The same question your mother probably asked you. He looked at her. What did you say? I said he was honest with me. And I thought that was better. She looked sideways at him, a brief look. I stole that from you. I stole it first, he said. From something I believed about you. She was quiet for a moment. She wants to talk more about it. When she visits in June, she's coming for a week in June, actually staying, not just passing through. She does that every couple of years. Another pause. She said she hoped it was real. Those exact words. He sat with that. She hoped it was real. Coming from a daughter who'd watched her mother build something extraordinary and lose something essential in the same season. Who had drawn her own conclusions at 14 and held them with the tenacity of grief. It is, he said. I know, Octavia said. I told her. They sat with that for a while. The bar had its usual Friday warmth, the particular accumulated human heat of a room full of people at the end of their working weeks. And outside the April evening was doing what April evenings did in Bellhaven, trying to be warm and mostly succeeding. Can I tell you something, she said. Yeah. I called a friend after I got off the phone with Margot. A woman I've known for 20 years, she was in my first company with me, back when first companies were things we did without any idea what we were doing. She turned her glass. I don't talk to her about personal things usually. But I called her. What did you tell her? I told her I was in a relationship. She already knew. Vaguely she'd seen the column, which is apparently what started Margause's call in the first place. But I told her properly. I told her about Elsie. She paused. She asked if I was scared. Are you? Yes, she said. Not the pause of someone performing honesty. The flat yes of someone who'd already finished deciding to say it. Not of you. Not of Elsie. She's made more room for me than I expected, and I haven't taken it for granted for a single day. Scared of what happens when you start wanting something specifically. Because specificity is where the risk lives. He understood that completely. The difference between generally hoping your life gets better and wanting a particular thing, that precision was where loss became possible. I'm scared too, he said differently. But yeah. I know. Does it change anything? She looked at him. Not for me, she said. I'm 50 years old. I've been scared of the right things my whole life. I'm reasonably sure this isn't one of them. He nodded slowly. The article, he said. The gossip column piece. Does it bother you? That it's out there? No, she said. And then, after a moment, it would have once. I spent years managing the image of the company and the image of myself as the person who runs it, and those two things got tangled in a way that was hard to separate. What people said about my personal life felt like it reflected on the professional, and I was protective of it. And now I'm 50, she said again, and I've found that I don't particularly care what a gossip column says about who I sit with on Friday nights. What I care about is whether the person I sit with on Friday nights is someone I want to be sitting with. She looked at him. The answer to that question has been the same since October. He felt the warmth of that, not sentimentally, but in the way you feel the warmth of something you weren't sure you deserved and then found out you'd been given anyway. I want to talk about the manuscript, she said. The shift was abrupt enough to be almost funny. Right now? Not right now. But I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to say it before I lost the nerve, which happens less often than it used to, but still occasionally happens.
Okay.
She looked at her glass rather than at him, which was the Octavia equivalent of taking a preparatory breath. When it's finished, she said, and it will be finished, I can see that in the way you talk about it now. The language has changed from evasion to logistics when it's finished. I want you to do it yourself. Submit it yourself. Don't tell me when you're doing it. Don't use my name or anything connected to me. He was quiet. I know what it would look like if you did use those connections, she continued. I know what people would assume. More importantly, I know what it would do to you, not to your reputation, but to the thing you'd feel about the work itself. The way you'd never quite know if it was what it was or if it was what I helped it become. I wasn't going to ask you, he said. I know you weren't, she said. I'm telling you not to, even if you somehow changed your mind about that. Even if it takes longer without the connections. Even if it's harder. She finally looked at him. Write it first. Let it belong to you completely, before anyone else decides what it's worth. He sat with this for a long moment. That's an unusual thing for someone who owns 4 publishing imprints to say, he said. That's why I mean it, she said. He thought about the 140 pages he'd left alone for 2 years. He thought about the 304 pages that existed now, which no one had read except him, which was still entirely his. He thought about the specific quality of something that belonged to no one yet but himself, that hadn't been evaluated or filtered through anyone else's opinion of its worth. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just finish it." He introduced Octavia to his mother on a Saturday afternoon in late April, which he handled by engineering what he described to his mother as a casual drop-by, and what was in practical terms an event he'd thought about extensively and then refused to plan further because the planning was becoming its own form of avoidance. His mother, whose name was Frances and who was 71 and had the particular quality of directness that seemed to run in the family, opened her apartment door, looked at Octavia for about 4 seconds, and said, "Come in." I made coffee. Octavia came in. Elsie, who had arrived 20 minutes earlier, and immediately sequestered herself in the bedroom, where Frances kept a collection of natural history books that Elsie treated as a personal lending library, appeared briefly in the hallway, said hi to Octavia, and went back to whatever she'd been reading. Frances made coffee and brought out a plate of cookies that Gideon recognized from the brand she'd been buying for 30 years. And they sat at the kitchen table, and Frances looked at Octavia with the concentrated attention of a woman who had raised a son alone and had opinions about who he chose to be around. "You're older than him," Frances said. "Mom," Gideon said. 15 years, Octavia said. "Yes, does that bother you?" "Not particularly," Octavia said. "Does it bother you?" Frances picked up her coffee. "That depends on whether you're going to break his heart." "Mom, I'm not going to get the chance to ask this very often," Frances said, without looking at him. She kept her eyes on Octavia. "He doesn't bring people here. He's been very careful for a long time. Some of that's good judgment, and some of it's self-protection that's gone on longer than it needed to." Octavia nodded. She wasn't performing discomfort, and she wasn't performing ease. She just sat with the question, the way she sat with everything directly. "I can't promise things I don't know yet," she said. "What I can tell you is that I'm not careless with him. And I'm not here for anything that isn't real." Frances studied her for a long moment. Then she looked at Gideon, then back at Octavia. "He told me you're honest," she said. "I thought that was a kind thing to say about someone. Now I think he was being accurate." She picked up her coffee. "That's a better start than most." May came, and the window finally got fixed. Gideon spent 2 hours on a Sunday with a screwdriver and a replacement gasket from the hardware store on Brennan Street, while Elsie supervised and periodically offered opinions on his technique. And when it finally closed properly, she said took you long enough with the serenity of someone who had never doubted the outcome. Octavia came to the apartment for the first time on the second Sunday in May. He'd agonized about the timing of this, then stopped agonizing because the agonizing was taking more energy than the thing itself deserved. She came over for dinner he cooked, which was one of the few domestic areas he was genuinely competent in, a pasta with a slowly built tomato sauce that Elsie conditionally approved of, provided there were no visible onions, which he'd learned to accommodate by dicing them to near invisibility. Octavia arrived with a flat rectangular package under her arm. Not wrapped decoratively. Brown paper tape practical. Elsie looked at it. "What's that?" "Something I saw that I thought you might want," Octavia said. "You don't have to keep it if you don't." Elsie took it and opened it with efficient purpose rather than theatrical excitement, tearing the paper back to reveal a book large format, heavy, the kind of reference book that costs what a reference book costs when it's genuine. Beetles of the World, a comprehensive illustrated guide. The cover showed a Crisina gloriosa in such clear, close resolution, its iridescent green almost red as three-dimensional. Elsie looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Octavia. "This is the Crisina gloriosa," she said. "I know," Octavia said. "It's on the cover. It's also called the glorious scarab," Elsie said. "It's one of the most visually striking beetles in North America." She said this as if offering a piece of information she suspected Octavia might not have, which was Elsie's form of reciprocal gift-giving, sharing something valuable. "I didn't know that," Octavia said, which was possibly true and possibly not, but either way was exactly the right answer. Elsie carried the book to the kitchen table and opened it to the table of contents with the focused reverence she reserved for serious reference materials, and Gideon caught Octavia's eye over the top of Elsie's head, and the look between them said several things simultaneously, and none of them required words. Dinner was imperfect in the way that dinners at kitchen tables with a 9-year-old are imperfect. Elsie knocked over her water glass 20 minutes in and absorbed the ensuing cleanup with the brisk acceptance of someone who considered accidents a logistical inconvenience rather than an occasion for shame, and Gideon had made too much pasta and not quite enough sauce, and the conversation moved in the non-linear way that conversations do when one of the participants is 9 and has the conversational authority of someone who treats topic transitions as a personal right. But Octavia ate everything on her plate. She asked Elsie questions that were real questions. When Elsie went off on a 15-minute consideration of whether the organizational system of her collection should be revised to incorporate a subcategory for beetles with unusual defensive mechanisms, Octavia listened to all of it and then said, "What would the criteria be for unusual? Unusual compared to what baseline?" Elsie stared at her. Then she said, "That's a really good question." "I haven't decided yet. Take your time," Octavia said. "The taxonomy should serve the collection, not the other way around." Gideon stood up to take the plates to the sink and stood there for a moment with his back to the table, listening to his daughter and this woman he loved, and yes, he was using the word now, internally, finally, without the editorial instinct to qualify it, and felt the weight of what was assembled around that kitchen table, imperfectly and genuinely, and without any guarantee about anything except that it was real. He did the dishes while they stayed at the table. He didn't rush. Later, after Elsie had gone to bed with her new book, and the apartment had settled into its evening quiet, Octavia and Gideon sat at the same kitchen table with the remains of the wine he'd opened, and Octavia looked around the room, the crayon birthday card still on the refrigerator, held by Elsie's preferred 11-strip masking tape arrangement, the stacks of library books on the counter, the Beetle reference book now added to a stack beside the door, for Elsie to take to her room in the morning, and she said, "You've built something real here." "We're still building it," he said. "That's what I mean," she said. "It's not finished, it's still going. That's the real part." He looked at her across the table, the woman who had sat at the far end of a bar for years because she'd decided she was unreachable, who had moved down the bar one night in October for no tactical reason other than being tired of doing nothing about a thing she was curious about, who had $3 billion and couldn't figure out for years how to get anyone to talk to her the way people talk to each other. "Stay a while longer," he said. "It's early." She didn't check her watch. She didn't calculate the drive home or the morning meeting or any of the architecture of life that was always scheduled. She just said okay and refilled her glass and stayed. And the kitchen was quiet and warm around them, and outside the May night had the tentative softness of a city finally letting go of winter, and Gideon thought not for the last time, but for one of the first times, without immediately arguing himself out of it, that this was what he'd been trying to write about all along. Not the man he'd been, the one he was in the process of becoming. He finished the manuscript on a Thursday night in September, 14 months after the first Friday at the Hawthorne Room. He didn't realize it was finished until he wrote the last sentence and sat back and read the final paragraph and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only at the end of something long and genuinely difficult, that there was nothing left to add. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't. There were chapters he'd rewritten 6 times, and still wasn't entirely satisfied with, passages that reached for something they didn't quite catch, a secondary character in the middle section who never fully came alive the way he'd intended. But it was done in the way that real things are done, not when they achieve some ideal state, but when they've become completely themselves, flaws included, and adding anything further would only be a form of interference. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. Elsie was asleep. The apartment was quiet. In the way apartments are quiet after 10 at night, the specific silence of a place that's been lived in, that carries the residue of the day in its settling sounds and its particular dark. The kitchen light was on over the table. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The manuscript was 381 pages on his screen, plus a title page he'd written in March and revised twice since, plus an acknowledgments page he'd written last week, and then deleted, and then rewritten in a different register, plainer 3 sentences instead of 12. He texted Octavia, "It's done." She called him instead of texting back. It was 11:17 at night, and she called, which she almost never did, unless something required more than a message. And when he picked up, she said, "Read me the last paragraph." He read it to her. His own voice in the quiet kitchen, reading his own words aloud for the first time, felt strange and right in a way he hadn't anticipated. Like hearing a song you wrote played back on an instrument that wasn't yours. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. "That's it," she said. "That's exactly it. You haven't read the rest of it." "I know," she said. "But that last paragraph, that's the whole thing, isn't it? That's what it was always going to be about." He looked at the paragraph on the screen. He thought maybe she was right. "Yeah," he said, "I think so." "How do you feel?" He thought about it genuinely. "Like I put something down that I've been carrying for a long time," he said. "And I don't know yet whether I'm relieved or just tired." "Both," she said. "It's always both." He smiled at the dark kitchen. "How are you so sure?" "Because finishing something real always costs you something," she said. "The relief comes after the cost clears." He closed the laptop when they hung up and went to bed and lay in the dark for a while. And slept better than he had since the night in November when he'd left the laptop open on the kitchen table because he couldn't quite bring himself to close it. He sent the manuscript out in October. Not to Octavia's imprints, he'd decided that in February and hadn't wavered. He researched agents the old way, slowly and methodically, the way he researched everything, and assembled a list of 15 names with careful notes on what each had represented and why each might or might not be right for this specific book. And he sent his query letters out in 2 batches and told no one except Priya, who said about time without looking up from her work, which was exactly the response he'd needed. He told Octavia the day the first batch went out. Not before he'd wanted the act to be entirely his own before it became a shared thing, and she'd understood that without being told. "Okay," she said when he told her. "How do you feel?" "Like I've mailed something irreplaceable to strangers," he said. "That's what it is," she said. "That's the accurate feeling. Very comforting." "I'm not in the business of false comfort," she said. "You know that, I know," he said. "I like it about you." "Mostly." She laughed the short, genuine kind that still felt like something earned. "Mostly," she agreed. He got his first rejection in 2 weeks, a form response so brief it was almost calming. He got 2 more in November, one of which included a sentence of actual feedback that told him the person had read at least part of it, which he chose to regard as progress. He kept writing not new fiction, but small things, essays he didn't intend to publish, observations he kept in a separate document that was not the manuscript and had no formal ambition. Just the habit of a man who'd learned that stopping entirely was harder to restart than continuing at a reduced pace. Octavia's daughter, Margot, came in June as promised, and left and came back again in October. The second visit unplanned and longer than the first, which Gideon understood was its own kind of statement. He met her for the first time at dinner in June, a restaurant Octavia had chosen carefully, somewhere quiet and good without the specific weight of somewhere expensive and performative, and Margot had Octavia's directness and her own version of it, sharper at the edges from having spent her 20s building something from the outside of her mother's world rather than inside it. She'd looked at him across the table with the specific assessment of someone who had been waiting to form this opinion for some time. "My mother doesn't do things carelessly," she said. Not an accusation, an observation with a question inside it. "I know," he said. "She's also very good at deciding she's fine when she isn't," Margot said. "She's been doing that since I was 14. "I know that, too," he said. Margot looked at him for a moment. "Do you actually?" "She told me," he said. "More than you might expect." That seemed to land somewhere. Margot picked up her wine and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "Elsie sounds like someone I'd like." "She is," he said. "She'll tell you more about beetles than you ever needed to know." "I grew up in a house where my mother talked about quarterly reports at the dinner table," Margot said. "Beetles are an improvement." Octavia across the table said nothing, but Gideon saw the thing that passed across her face, something careful and raw and carefully managed. The face of a woman receiving something she'd been waiting a long time to receive and wasn't sure she'd earned. He looked away from it, because some things are too private to witness, even when you're allowed in the room. By October, when Margot came back for the second visit, she and Elsie had exchanged approximately 40 texts about beetles, and also, inexplicably, about competitive baking shows that Margot apparently watched, and Elsie had never seen but had opinions about based on Margot's descriptions. Gideon found this so unlikely and so entirely characteristic of both of them that he stopped trying to understand it and simply accepted it as evidence that life had its own organizing intelligence that exceeded his planning capacity. The call came on a Wednesday in late November, 15 months after the manuscript went out. He was at work, editing a long feature piece on the city's public transit overhaul, when his phone showed an unfamiliar New York number. He almost didn't answer. He was in the middle of a sentence that wasn't working, and he was close to fixing it, and the interruptions was poorly timed, but something made him pick up. "Is this Gideon Fairmont?" The voice was a woman's, professional, with the specific quality of someone who makes calls that matter for a living. "Yeah," he said. "This is Claire Sato. I'm a literary agent at Meridian Literary. I'm calling about your manuscript." He put down his pen. He walked out of the newsroom into the hallway, which was quieter, and stood under the fluorescent light next to the fire extinguisher cabinet, which was not a glamorous location for a conversation he'd been waiting 15 months for. "I've read it twice," she said. "The second time I read it because I wanted to be sure about the first time." "I'm sure." He held the phone and said nothing. "It's not a straightforward sell," she said, with the honesty of someone who'd been in her business long enough to know that honesty costs less in the long run than optimism. "The market is what it is, and this is a quiet book. Quiet in the best way, but quiet. I won't pretend it'll be easy. What I can tell you is that I believe in it completely, and I'd like to represent it if you're interested." He stood under the fluorescent light next to the fire extinguisher for another moment. "Yes," he said. "I'm interested." He called Octavia from the parking garage on his break, standing between two cars in the cold, because he needed to tell someone, and she was the person, and he wasn't willing to wait until Friday. She picked up on the second ring. He told her. She was quiet for long enough that he said, "Are you there?" "I'm here," she said. Her voice was different from usual, not emotional exactly, but full in a way that it wasn't always. I'm sitting here thinking about the man who told me he was scared to reread his own pages, because either way he'd lose something." "He found something instead," Gideon said. "Yes," she said. He did. There was a pause. Then she said, "I'm proud of you." I want to say that plainly because I don't say plain things often enough. He stood in the parking garage in the November cold and held the phone and felt the weight of that, not the literary agent, not the manuscript, not the 15 months of rejection and persistence, but those 4 words from the person who'd told him in October to let it belong to him first, before anyone else decided what it was worth. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "You did the work." "I know. I'm thanking you anyway." December came back around, the second December since October at the Hawthorne Room, and Bellhaven put up its lights again, and Elsie insisted on an even larger tree than the previous year, which was technically impossible given the door frame, but which she treated as a solvable engineering problem. And they spent a Saturday morning moving furniture and discovered that with the couch repositioned and the bookcase shifted 6 inches, they could accommodate a tree that was, by any reasonable measure, too large for the apartment and completely correct for the occasion. Octavia was there for the tree decorating. She'd been there for a lot of things by then, Saturday dinners, Sunday mornings that started early, because Elsie's internal schedule had no concept of sleeping in, the school science fair in October, where Elsie's exhibit on beetle defensive mechanisms had won second place, and she'd argued, publicly and without embarrassment, that the first-place project on volcanic rock formations was interesting, but less rigorously researched, which the judges had responded to with the slightly startled respect that unsentimental correctness tends to produce in adults who'd expected the usual performance of gracious loss. Octavia had stood at the back of the gymnasium during Elsie's argument with the judges, and when Elsie had come over afterward, second-place ribbon in hand, wearing the expression of someone who had said what needed to be said and was comfortable with the outcome, Octavia had said, "You're right about the research. For what it's worth." Elsie had looked at her. "I know," she said. "Second place is fine. The point was to say it." "Yes," Octavia said. It was. Gideon had watched them and thought, there it is. That exact exchange, that specific frequency, that was the thing Elsie had been looking for since March, when she'd stood at the display case in the Natural History Museum asking about horn leverage and deciding whether a woman who'd looked things up was worth the effort of trusting. She'd found her answer gradually, the way Elsie found all her answers, through evidence and patience and her own unrushed timetable. Now, in December, Octavia sat on the floor of the apartment next to the too large tree, while Elsie directed the ornament placement with the authority of someone who had strong views about aesthetic balance. And Gideon made hot chocolate in the kitchen and listened to the two of them argue cheerfully about whether the cluster of silver ornaments on the left side was a deliberate counterweight to the blue cluster on the right, or just an accident that needed correcting. It's intentional, Elsie said. The gap between them is uneven, Octavia said. That's the point. Symmetry is boring. Asymmetry is a choice, not an accident, Octavia said. There's a difference. I know that, Elsie said. I chose it. A pause. All right, Octavia said. It stays. Gideon brought the hot chocolate in and set the mugs down on the coffee table and looked at the scene: the overly large tree, the sprawl of ornament boxes on the floor, the woman who ran a billion-dollar empire sitting cross-legged on his living room floor, engaged in genuine debate with his 10-year-old daughter about the semiotics of Christmas tree design, and felt something so specific and uncomplicated that it cut right through the layers he'd spent years building up. He loved this. He loved all of it, the imperfect specific weight of it, the too big tree and the hot chocolate and the argument about symmetries, and all the ordinary Sunday afternoon texture of a life that had more people in it now than he'd planned for, and was accordingly harder to manage and better in every way that mattered. He sat down on the couch and picked up his mug and said nothing, and nobody asked him to say anything, and the afternoon went on. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in January, which was so ordinary a choice of day and setting that it would have seemed almost deliberately anticlimactic if it hadn't been exactly right. He hadn't planned it for a Tuesday. He hadn't planned it for a specific day at all, in the way that people who spend a lot of time planning specific things sometimes arrive at a point where the planning becomes an obstacle rather than a preparation. He'd known since sometime in November that he was going to ask. He'd known since sometime in November that he'd been working his way toward it, and that the working toward had its own value and its own timeline, and didn't need to be accelerated. What happened on the Tuesday was that Elsie was at a friend's house for dinner, and Octavia had come over after a board meeting that had run late, and she was still partly in the meeting when she arrived. The particular preoccupied quality she had after things at work required her full force, and he'd made dinner not elaborate, pasta again. The sauce he made well enough that Elsie had gradually stopped complaining about the invisible onions, and they'd eaten. And the dishes were done, and they were sitting at the kitchen table with wine. And the apartment was quiet around them, in the way it was quiet on weekday evenings when Elsie wasn't there. A different quality of quiet, looser. Octavia had been talking about a decision she was sitting with whether to sell one of the smaller companies in her portfolio, a trade magazine group that had been underperforming for 2 years, and that she'd been holding on to partly out of loyalty to the staff, and partly out of the particular stubbornness she admitted to freely and managed with mixed success. She'd been working through it aloud, the way she sometimes did with him, now not asking for a business opinion, because she knew more about her business than anyone, but using the conversation the way writers use drafts, to find out what you actually think by saying it to someone who's actually listening. He listened. He asked 2 questions and made 1 observation, and then let her finish working through it. She arrived at an answer. She wasn't going to sell it yet. She was going to restructure the leadership first and give it 18 months, because she owed the decision that, and she looked across the table at him with the expression she had when she'd found the thing she was looking for and was satisfied. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do anything." "You listened," she said. "That's not nothing." He looked at her across the kitchen table. The wine glasses between them. The school books still stacked on the counter from the morning. The too big tree visible through the doorway, past its prime now, dropping needles at a rate that Elsie monitored with the same attention she gave to everything important. The slippers that Octavia had started keeping by the door in November, because she'd come over in heels twice in 1 week and complained about it once, which, for Octavia, constituted a significant public statement about a recurring inconvenience. He thought about October. He thought about a woman sitting at the far end of a bar for years because she'd decided she was unreachable, and then moving down the bar one night because she was tired of not doing anything about a thing she was curious about. He thought about a cocktail napkin in careful left-leaning handwriting. "I'll be here next Friday if you want to continue the conversation." He'd continued the conversation. "You once asked me something," he said. She looked at him. She was good at attention, and she was paying it now, the full weight of it, the kind that didn't wander. That first night, he said, you asked if drinking alone was by choice. She was very still. I told you both, he said, and then I told you mostly the second. He turned his wineglass once. I want to tell you something different now. She said nothing. She just held his eyes. I don't want to be alone by choice or by default or by circumstance or by anything else, he said. I want Elsie to grow up knowing this is what a family looks like, whatever shape it takes, whatever it costs to hold it together.
He stopped.
Not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because he was being careful with it, the way he was careful with words when they mattered. I want you to be here, he said, not just on Fridays, not just when it's convenient. Here, in the actual daily weight of the thing. Octavia was still not speaking. Her expression was not readable in the way her expressions were usually at least partially readable to him. He pushed forward because stopping would have been worse. I'm not doing this the way people do it, he said. I don't have a ring. I didn't plan a restaurant. It's a Tuesday, and there are pine needles on the floor from a tree we should have taken down a week ago, and there's probably still pasta stuck to the pot in the sink because I did the dishes fast. He looked at her directly. Marry me. The silence lasted long enough that he became aware of the refrigerator hum, and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside, and the tree dropping another needle somewhere in the living room. Then Octavia laughed. Not the polite kind, not the social kind. The real kind, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, and came out of her with what seemed like actual surprise, as if the laugh itself had caught her off guard. And her eyes went bright in the way that happened when something moved her, and she didn't entirely have control of it, which was rare enough that he'd learned to recognize it. You're proposing to me on a Tuesday, she said. Yes. At the kitchen table.
Yes.
With pasta in the sink. Probably, he confirmed. I did a quick job on the dishes. She laughed again, shorter this time, and then she stopped laughing and she looked at him with something that was not the composed, collected, direction-facing expression of the woman who ran a company and managed a board and sat across from difficult men in difficult meetings. Without blinking, it was the other face. The one he'd been the primary audience for over the past 14 months, the one that was just her, unmanaged and real. Yes, she said. Simple, clean, one syllable, all the weight in the world in it. He let out a breath he hadn't entirely known he'd been holding. Yes, she said again, and reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over his, which was what she'd done at the Hawthorne Room in February in the rain. The first time she'd done it, no agenda and no calculation, just a hand on his hand because she'd wanted to and because it was true. Every part of it, all the Tuesdays. He turned his hand over under hers. They sat like that for a while, at the kitchen table in the apartment, with the overly large, dying tree in the next room, and the pasta in the sink, and the slippers by the door, and the school books on the counter. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because nothing needed to be said. And that was one of the things he'd learned about her over 14 months, that she understood the difference between a silence that needed filling and one that didn't, and she never filled the ones that didn't. Elsie's first question, when he told her the following morning over breakfast, was, "Does that mean she's staying forever?" "Yes," he said. Elsie ate her toast. She processed this with the thoroughness she applied to significant information. Then she said, she should put more stuff here. She only has the slippers and that one coffee cup she uses. We'll work on that, he said. Also, Elsie said, I think we should get a dog. That's a separate conversation. I'm just saying. If we're changing things anyway. Elsie. I'll bring it up again later, she said with complete serenity, and finished her toast. The book sold in March, 14 months after Claire Sato called him from New York. Not to one of Octavia's imprints, to a mid-sized independent press in Portland, that Claire said was exactly the right home for it. And she was right. Gideon could see it immediately in the editor's letter that accompanied the offer, the specific things she'd responded to, the way she'd understood what the book was trying to do, and had real ideas about helping it do it better. He told Octavia after he'd said yes to the offer, after the contract was signed, after the thing was done and belonged entirely to itself and to no one's goodwill or connection or positioning. He called her from the parking garage again, standing between the same two cars as far as he could tell, and when she picked up, he said, "It's sold." Another of her silences, the full-weight kind. "Tell me," she said. He told her. The press, the editor, the terms that were not extravagant and were fair, the timeline, all of it. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her specific gifts, the ability to listen to something completely before responding, to let the thing be fully itself before she started having opinions about it. When he finished, she said, "The editor's letter. What did she respond to?" He told her that too. And when he got to the part about what the editor had said, about the manuscript's emotional core, about the man at the center of it, and the specific quality of his transformation, not dramatic, not clean, but incrementally and resistantly real, Octavia was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "She got it." "Yeah," he said, "she got it." "Good," she said, "then it's in the right place." He stood in the parking garage in the March cold and felt the full, complicated satisfaction of something that had been entirely his own succeeding on its own terms, which is a different feeling from any other kind of success, and one he hadn't expected to feel in quite this way. There was still fear in it. The book would be published in the fall, and people would read it, and some of them would not like it, and some would, and the whole uncertain apparatus of public reception lay. Ahead, but underneath the fear, was something solid. The knowledge that he'd written it honestly and finished it and sent it out without shortcuts, and that it had found its way. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me. When you said to write it first, to let it belong to me before anyone else decided what it was worth." He paused. "That was the most important thing anyone said to me about my work. Possibly about anything." She was quiet for a moment. "I meant it. I know you did," he said. "That's what made it matter." The wedding was in September, almost exactly 2 years after the first night at the Hawthorne Room. And it was small in the way that things are small when the people involved have thought seriously about what they actually want, rather than what they're expected to want. 30 people. The back garden of a restaurant on the east side of downtown that Octavia had known for years, and that had a courtyard with old trees and string lights and enough outdoor heat lamps for the September evening chill. A ceremony that was 15 minutes long and said everything that needed saying without saying more. Elsie, who had finally extracted a partial agreement on the dog subject, served as the one who carried the rings, which she did with the concentrated gravity of someone who understood the weight of the assignment. Margot flew in from London. She sat in the front row next to Frances, who had brought cookies that she'd made that morning because she'd been asked not to and had decided the request didn't apply to her. At some point during the reception, Gideon looked across the courtyard and saw Margot and Elsie standing by the dessert table. Elsie explaining something with her hands and Margot listening with an expression that was entirely her mother's, the full-weight attention, the real kind. Octavia found him looking. "What are they talking about?" she asked. "Either Beatles or competitive baking," he said. "Those are the options." "Those have always been the options," she said. He looked at her. She was in something dark and simple that wasn't a traditional wedding dress and didn't need to be, and she had the look of a woman who had made a considered decision and was completely at peace with it, which was the most purely happy he'd ever seen her. "You okay?" he said, because he asked her that sometimes, not performatively, but because he actually wanted the answer. "Yes," she said. Actually, specifically, yes. She looked at the courtyard, the small assembled group of people, the old trees, the string lights doing what they could against the September dark, Frances distributing unrequested cookies to anyone within reach. "This is what I wanted," she said. "I didn't know how to say it out loud for a long time. But this is it. A backyard wedding with cookies nobody asked for? People I actually want in the same place," she said. "At the same time. That's all. That's the whole thing." He took her hand. She held it. What Gideon understood in the years that followed was something he'd been trying to write about without quite knowing it from the first page of that 140-page rough draft he'd abandoned, and then returned to, and then finished. That the stories we tell ourselves about what we need are almost always smaller than what we actually need, and the distance between those two things is where most of the real living happens. He told himself he needed very little. Safety routine. The Friday drink. A life that was sealed against further loss. He'd told himself that choosing that life was wisdom rather than fear, which is the kind of thing you tell yourself when the difference between wisdom and fear has gotten too small to measure. What he actually needed was harder to protect and harder to lose. It required being known by someone, really known, the way Octavia had known something about him from across a bar before she even knew his name. It required being witnessed not admiringly, not with the quality of attention that wants something from you, but the attention that simply looks at what's there, because what's there is worth looking at. He'd needed to finish the thing he'd abandoned. Not for the career of it, not for what it proved, but because leaving it unfinished had been a kind of daily small betrayal of himself that he'd gotten so accustomed to, he'd stopped feeling it. Finishing it gave something back that he hadn't known he was missing until it was returned. And he'd needed, though this was the last thing he would have admitted in October of the year before, to let Elsie watch him be loved. Not to shield her from the risk of it or from the ways it could fail, but to let her see what it looked like when two people chose each other carefully and honestly, and without the performance of certainty that love doesn't actually come with. He'd thought for years that being alone was the safest thing he could model for her. He'd been wrong. What he'd been modeling was a man who'd decided the cost of trying was too high, and she was too smart not to learn that lesson if he kept teaching it. She'd grown up, in the years after, knowing that family wasn't a fixed thing that came pre-assembled. It was built slowly by people who showed up and told the truth and stayed through the ordinary weight of each other's difficult days. It wasn't a thing you had. It was a thing you did constantly imperfectly on Tuesdays as much as on the occasions that called for string lights. He'd learned that from a woman who moved down a bar one night because she was tired of doing nothing about something she was curious about. And from a daughter who'd sat at a kitchen table with a magnifying glass and asked him if he was happy, because she already knew the important question even when he didn't. Friday nights at the Hawthorne Room continued. They had become over 2 years of Friday nights, something Gideon would have been embarrassed to describe out loud, but which he thought about with the seriousness he gave to the things that actually held his life together. They were not romantic. In the conventional sense, they were two people sitting at a bar, talking about work and the week and Elsie and the world, the way old friends sit, or the way long-married people sit when they've grown comfortable enough with each other to not need the conversation to perform anything. Sometimes they sat in something close to silence, reading or thinking separately but together, the specific companionship of shared quiet. Sometimes they argued about her business decisions that he thought were too conservative or not conservative enough, about his writing and the choices he made in it, about the news, about how to handle a thing Elsie was going through, about whatever required arguing about, because they were both people who thought arguing was more useful than avoiding, when done in good faith. Sometimes he looked at her across the bar and thought about the version of himself who'd sat at this same spot 2 years ago, carefully not wanting anything, and felt what it felt like to know that version and not be him anymore. On a Friday in October, 2 years to the month from when it started, Gideon leaned toward Octavia at their usual spot end of the bar, near the window, the potted plant still in its corner, still awaiting relocation, and said, "Is this still by choice?" She looked at him. He knew that look. He'd cataloged it over 2 years, the full unguarded version that was just her. She took his hand across the bar. "Every single part of it," she said. Outside, Belhaven moved through its October evening, the leaves coming down, the sky doing its early dark, the lights of the city gathering against it in the way lights do when the year starts to close. Inside, the Hawthorne Room was warm and full of the ordinary noise of other people's Fridays, and Carl moved up and down the bar with the efficiency of a man who had long since stopped needing to ask what the regulars wanted. There are people who find each other at the right time, and people who find each other at the wrong time, and people who find each other at no time in particular, just a specific ordinary evening, when one of them was tired of sitting at the other end of the bar and the other one had nowhere better to be. The timing wasn't elegant. The circumstances weren't designed. The 15 years between them, and the billions between them, and the small girl, with the Beetle collection between them, were all real, and none of them were small. Real things rarely are. But what Gideon Fairmont had learned, imperfectly and over time and not without cost, was that the life you actually want is usually on the other side of the thing you've decided is too complicated to attempt. Not always, not guaranteed, but often enough to make the attempt worth the fear of it. He'd been alone by default for 3 years and called it choice. Then someone had asked him whether it was, and the rest, imperfect and specific and entirely his, had followed from the honest answer. He held his wife's hand at the bar where everything began, in the city they both called home, on a Friday night in October, and there was nothing left unresolved.